What are the risks of inbreeding or incest? Is it true that entire empires have fallen because of this practice? In this report, we'll discuss that and many other topics. About a year ago, a documentary made by a photographer about a peculiar American family, the Whitakers, went viral, which was defined as the most incestuous family in the United States. Endogamy or incest is reproduction among members of the same bloodline. Our genetics carry flaws and virtues. When two people with different genetic arcs come together, the genes complement each other. And that diversity means that the flaws belonging to one branch do not necessarily pass on to the next generation. However, when this diversity does not occur, and genes from two people who have the same deficiencies are mixed, it is more likely that these problems will pass on to the offspring. Therefore, the further incestuous relationships progress, the more likely it is that physical or mental illnesses will appear. With this information, we can better prepare ourselves for the Whitaker case. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're going to get to know this Virginia family in a very particular way, with a list of incestuous families that will show them how this practice played a vital role in the downfall of renowned royal families. In addition, we're going to add a bonus track with a terrifying story which also inspired a very scary and quite classic movie. Let's see if you can guess which movie we're talking about, and I invite you right now to leave your like, subscribe and turn on notifications. Welcome to this special on endogamic families. Before we start, I want to leave you with a question to see if you know the answer. When we talk about Egypt, we obviously remember the pyramids, the slaves, the desert, well, everything that surrounds a bit of all the non-Egyptian mythology. But there was a very important pharaoh that some have an image of, but his real image was completely different. A person who was born with many defects, with many deformities, and who had to walk with the support of canes and died very, very young. Do you know which pharaoh we are talking about? I bring it up because obviously he was a product of inbreeding, and that's why what happened to him happened. If you know which pharaoh I am naming now, I invite you to leave your comment below, and I also invite you, obviously, to leave suggestions for possible future videos. And now, without further delay, let's get started. Case number Romanov. Even though we may not know it, inbreeding is very much related to many stories we already know. Stories related to kings, to fights between families, for example. Did you know that inbreeding is very closely related to this very strange character that was Rasputin? I'm going to tell you. It turns out that Rasputin managed to become a personality because with his unconventional methods, he managed to keep the Tsar's son, Nicholas, alive. With that action, he earned the respect and admiration of the family members, which would make him a constant collaborator of power. The question is, what was happening to the Tsar's son, the Tsarevich Alexei, that he needed constant attention? The young man suffered from hemophilia, a condition that prevents the correct coagulation of the blood, and depending on its severity, can cause death from bleeding due to a simple cut. This condition had affected some of Alexei's brothers, even leading them to the grave. Was it a genetic disease inherited due to incest in his family? Yes, his parents belonged to the same family tree, which caused their descendants, especially Alexei, to have many health problems. However, the Romanovs were not the only royal family weakened by genetic defects caused by constant marriage between close relatives. In other cases, inbreeding would become the destroyer of entire clans. The Habsburg hunt in Spain is another great example of this. In the past, kings sought to maintain their power and rule indefinitely. A not at all intelligent plan to promote reproduction among members of the same family. The goal was not to have to pass the throne from hand to hand and to create pure blood. Nothing could be further from the truth. Art and history scholars agree that there is a particular detail that serves as clear evidence of the physical and intellectual decline that the Habsburgs suffered over the years. The family portraits. In these portraits, you can see how the members of this family had very special characteristics. Even deformities that were the result of this genetic information that was poorly formed generation after generation. It would later be known that 9 out of every 11 Habsburg marriages were between close relatives, and that beyond the speculations that there were about their fall, the truth is that the Habsburgs were not capable of occupying a throne. Charles II was the last member of the family. His inability to communicate or reason and his chronic sterility were the consequences of years of inbreeding. His death marked the end of that dynasty, whose passage forever altered the course of events in Europe. After these precedents, inbreeding began to be studied more closely and ceased to be a recommended habit. However, that did not mean that isolated cases did not continue to exist years later. Cases that would become evident due to the strange consequences that would befall their victims. Consequences such as, for example, an unusual blue skin. Case the Fugate family. This story begins in the year 1958, or at least that was the time when everything came to light. The truth is that everything had started much earlier. That day in the late 50s, there was widespread confusion in the waiting room of the University Hospital of Kentucky in Washington District of Columbia. The evening was falling when a man named Luke Comp rushed in from emergencies. He was sweaty, he seemed nervous, and was waving his arms from side to side while screaming. He wanted help for his lady, who was about to give birth. Even though the staff at the place were familiar with situations that required quick action, they took a while to pay attention to what Luke was saying. The man, in fact, had to repeat his needs to them a couple of times. Those who were watching him couldn't believe their eyes. Luke's skin was completely blue and it didn't seem like paint. Looking at him was so shocking that many of those present claimed that just by observing the subject, they felt a kind of dizziness. Through sheer willpower and insistence, Luke managed to snap the receptionists out of their trance. When his wife was finally moved on a stretcher, he collapsed on a bench, exhausted. As he took deep breaths, a doctor approached him, bluntly telling him that he needed to run some tests. Luke held his gaze for a while. He knew that the color of his skin was not normal, and that's why he didn't often interact with other people. With some resignation, he let them draw his blood and parade him around a series of devices that he didn't quite understand what they were supposed to do. The blood tests that were performed on Combe confirmed an anomaly. The Blue Man, as he was known when his case reached the press, suffered from a very rare hereditary disease called methemoglobinemia. This disorder causes in those who suffer from it that strange coloration similar to that of hypothermia states. And for what reason? Because it is a disorder that makes hemoglobin unable to effectively release oxygen into body tissues. But if he was right, it meant that Luke was not the only one with this condition. Luke told them that indeed the disease had been passed down from his ancestors. When he saw that the doctors didn't quite understand, he set out to tell them a story. A story he had never told anyone. A story that dated back to 1820. It turns out that in that year, the patriarch of the clan, Martin Fugate, had married Elizabeth Smith, a young woman from the area. They then moved together to Troublesome Creek, a rather sparsely populated town in Kentucky in the Appalachian Mountains. The couple had 7 children. Of those 7, 3 were born with blue skin. This condition made their few neighbors look at them like circus freaks. Martin and Elizabeth didn't know that their children's unusual skin color was part of a recessive gene that they both shared in their DNA. It was a rarity, of course, but with reproductive openness, the problem didn't have to persist in the offspring. The question is, why had the blue tone reached Luke Simple? Tired of being pointed out in the street, the Fugates had become more and more isolated. Over time, this resulted in them losing contact with the outside world. The 7 siblings began to have relationships among themselves, and the blue skin gradually multiplied in this family. By then, the rumor was spreading as if it were an urban legend that some blue people lived in the mountains. After Luke told this, it was confirmed that more than 100 people in the family still had skin of that color. Once inbreeding ended and the family began to open up, the genetic alteration disappeared, leaving Kentucky without its famous blue men. This story has a happy ending, but the one coming up now is a bit more gruesome. Case number 2, the Colt family. This case took place in Australia and shocked the world in the year 2012. The horror was discovered when a group of police officers were alerted to a precarious settlement in an isolated field located in the rural area of Victoria in New South Wales. According to the complaints, there were tents and a group of children were living in unsanitary conditions. The officers went to the place with social workers. They knew they would find a disheartening scene, but nothing prepared them for what they found on the lands that had been taken over by Tom Colt and his clan. The newcomers found about 30 adults in extreme marginalization and a dozen children practically in a state of abandonment, some of them with deformities and disabilities. As would be recorded in the minutes, it was noticeable that the children had never seen a person outside of their inner circle. They barely knew how to speak. They did their necessities in nature. They didn't know toothbrushes and washed themselves with a bucket of water that was already thick from being so dirty. It was evident that they were not schooled and that at least 7 of them had serious cognitive difficulties. The place was full of garbage bags. There was a nauseating smell and the electrical connection was precarious and threatened to cause some kind of fatal accident. Immediately, the adults were imprisoned and interrogated. It was discovered that many of them had severe deficiencies, and the origin of all the horror could also be corroborated. Tom Colt had more than 10 children with his wife June. He then abused his daughters, who had more children, who later began to relate to their own brothers and sisters. The Colts were manipulated by Tom, who had created a kind of sect with more than 38 members who carried his same genes. But it should be clarified that by the time all this was known, Tom Colt had already been dead for 3 years. All the evidence points to an incestuous, intragenerational, and intrafamilial abuse relationship. Undeniable, expressed the ruling of a juvenile court that handled the case. The same ruling noted that there was no real possibility of returning any of the children to their parents. The scheme that the Australian justice system put together shows that there were 4 generations of incest living together, among which there were 14 minors who were great-grandchildren and grandchildren of Tom Colt. 8 members of the Colt family were prosecuted for incest, child abuse, indecency against a child, and perjury. However, of the 80 charges filed, almost none were successful, and to this day, only 4 Colts remain behind bars. Some of the children are currently with foster families, while others are attending psychological treatment programs. According to some reports, there is a possibility that other members of the Colt family escaped from the police raid that arrested them and have been fugitives in the United States since that year, still living in a closed community and reproducing among themselves. According to some unofficial testimonies, they would work in freak shows. And speaking of freaks, is it necessary to go back to Mark Later and the Whitakers? And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. Mark Later is an American producer and photographer, and one of his projects involves portraying people from different social strata, different professions, and with various distinctive features. What started with a search for freaks ended up in a showcase of the diversity of human beings one can encounter. Human beings who from the outside are already different and often represent their environment with their manners, gestures, or attire. The idea of this project was to show how portraits are capable of accounting for much more than the peculiarities of a face. It was then when a police officer who knew about his work contacted him and told him that he had to travel to West Virginia, more precisely to a town called Odd. There were there, according to the agent, some people whose story might be interesting to them. He emphasized that it was necessary for him to bring the camera because he was going to see things hard to believe. Of course, Laita gave in to curiosity and followed the instructions given by that officer. Thus, he took a rural road and arrived at a small community. The officer had given him an exact address and a surname, the Whitaker family. we can affirm that things did not start in the best way. Laida approached the house and noticed something strange occurring inside. It seemed that there was a man there who communicated with nothing more and nothing less than barks. However, before he could wonder what was going on, a neighbor confronted him with a weapon and told him to leave the Whitakers alone. Laida had to insist for the other to believe that he had no bad intentions. However, before he could finish explaining himself, it could be seen that some men who clearly had physical deformities were coming out of the House of Discord. They seemed angry, and although they were babbling, the message they were professing was clear. They were not happy with the presence of the photographer. Laida had to leave on that occasion, but it didn't take him long to discover why the family was so violent. They were tired of people coming to their door to mock their conditions. Laida wanted to know the reasons behind these conditions, but no one had an answer. One way or another, the man became obsessed with these people and visited them again, this time escorted by the police. He had found out that a member of the clan had recently died. He then proposed to the family to take photos to decorate the funeral of the deceased relative. The others had a hard time understanding it, but when they did, the tension among everyone began to ease. After that first visit, Laida maintained a fluid relationship with the Whitakers, which over time only increased their trust in him. Thus came Inbred Family from the Whitakers, a documentary that later would premiere about the Whitakers on his YouTube channel. In that film, 4 members of the Whitaker family were introduced: Betty, Lorraine, Ray, and their cousin Timmy. A year after the premiere in 2021, Betty told the filmmaker that her parents indeed were related, that is, they were double first cousins. After this confession, there was no doubt that the anomalies, both mental and physical in the family, were largely due to this incest. It's true that some looked at Laida's work with morbid curiosity, seeking to find monsters in those people. The rest of those who saw the documentary were shocked by the state of precariousness in which this family had to operate. And so it was that public donations came in that helped to improve the reality in which they lived. This collaborative mechanism resulted in the Whitaker's house being improved. The ITA recorded all these improvements. It remains in constant contact with these individuals and ensures that the money they receive can be well managed to give them a better quality of life. The story was taken with ambiguity instead of rejoicing, because the work of this artist meant a benefit for the family. Many were disappointed to find that the victims of incest were not depraved individuals with an uncontrollable murderous thirst. The question is, why do we collectively have this preconception that endogamous families are all monstrous and violent? Where does this come from? Well, to answer this, we have to go back to a series of fictions that always made sure to portray incest as a generator of psychopaths. Look no further, Wes Craven, creator of Freddy Krueger, premiered a movie called The Hills in 1977, Have Eyes, in which people from the same family tree, who reproduced among themselves, killed people and then ate them. What few people know is that this is based on a true story. Ready for this terrifying bonus track? This extra only for the brave originated between 1550 and 1600. It is believed that at some point during these years a boy named Sweeney Binny Sweeney was born in Scotland. He was part of a poor family, and although as a child he was always characterized by a big smile, as an adult he would be remembered as a terrible monster. The boy quickly learned out of an early necessity the trade of his family. From a young age, he was already recognized as a roofer and a ditch digger. It goes without saying that at that time, these were jobs that required great physical effort and were, moreover, precarious. These jobs were usually done by lower-class people who were subjected to covert slavery by wealthy families. Understanding the unfortunate nature of this situation, Sweeney did not seem very enthusiastic about the future that awaited him. That's why he decided to run away from home with his companion, ready to forge a destiny somewhere else. Sweeney was looked down upon for his constant dissatisfaction and his lack of interest in being exploited. The woman he ran away with didn't have a better reputation. She was known as Black Agnes, and it's not clear why many claimed she was a witch. We also don't know how both of them ended up, after weeks of wandering, settling in a cave in the coastal town of Galloway. What we do know is that this would be known later. For people, Sweeney and Agnes had simply disappeared off the map, and nothing was known about the couple. Until a few years later, when it became known, a scene worthy of a nightmare. As it is known, the man and the woman had gone mad from loneliness and hunger. One day they had left their cave and killed a traveler to feed on him. That missing traveler was soon followed by others. Around those years, the legend began to spread that the unwary were dragged by the forces of the beyond when they ventured into forbidden paths. A story that gave Sweeney and his wife a screen behind which to hide their crimes. When the number of missing people did not stop with the passing of the months, the alarm gave way to a collective hysteria. Some records of the time speak of more than 1,000 people who would have gone missing. At least until 25 years after it all began. It was at that moment when a man went to the authorities, bloodied, beaten, and with his clothes in tatters. In a whisper, he told the on-duty officers that a couple had attacked him and his companion on a road. After subduing them, they had taken them to a cave. He had managed to escape, but he had seen them start to eat his woman. The officers knew that this was the lead they had always been waiting for, and immediately moved 400 uniformed men to the mentioned hideout. What they would find would leave them paralyzed. Indeed, there was a cave and the corpse of a woman, but the perpetrators were not just a couple. The clan was about 50 people. Sweeney and Agnes had had children and then had children with their children. The result, a retinue of people with notable intellectual deficiencies and explicit violence who behaved like animals. They all lived in wild states, surrounded by decomposing human remains. Sweeney Bean and his family were forced to dig graves for the victims, and after declaring them guilty of multiple murders, cannibalism, blasphemy, and many other crimes, they were executed. The story is terrible, and even today the truth of it is still debated. While many agree that there are records from the time that support the entire story, many others argue that perhaps we are facing a fake news story that had a clear purpose of defaming the Scottish candidates for the throne of England. What do you think of this story, hoax or reality? What there is no doubt about is that there was a famous Egyptian pharaoh to whom inbreeding brought many problems. Remember the question at the beginning? Well, it's time to answer it. Most of us have heard at some point about Tutankhamun. Some know his full story, what he meant for his dynasty and his legacy. Others know him for the alleged curse that was awakened when a group of archaeologists came across his mummy. Either way, Tutankhamun has always been synonymous with great power, and today we know that things were not quite so. Tutankhamun ascended to the throne at a very young age and died, according to some researchers, in 1324 before Christ at the age of 19. He would have spent those 19 years suffering from a variety of ailments. When canes were found among his belongings and it was seen that he suffered malformations in his foot and spine, there was much speculation about what ailment he might have suffered from. While it was discovered that tropical malaria had ended his days, many studies wondered if the mythical pharaoh might have suffered from gynecomastia, Marfan syndrome, X-linked recessive inheritance of Wilson-Turner, Froelich syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, androgen insensitivity syndrome, or something similar. And as if this were not enough, in January of 2005, a computed axial tomography of the mummy of Tutankhamun was performed. And the results showed that he had a mild case of cleft palate and possibly also a mild case of scoliosis. This sum of factors ultimately demonstrated that the most logical explanation for his ailments was the fact that his parents were part of the same family tree. It is known from the fetuses found in his tomb that he had 2 children who were stillborn. Yes, having said that, it's easy to reach the next conclusion. Inbreeding was a crucial part of the downfall of the most powerful dynasty of the New Kingdom. As it becomes clear, after all that has been exposed, when a small population remains isolated by mistake or by choice for too long, the loss of genetic diversity causes genetic peculiarities to be amplified. Peculiarities that, in most cases, only decrease the evolutionary and survival capacity of those involved. Beyond our cultural education, there are many countries where incest is not illegal. There are countries where even the relationship between cousins is encouraged. In other countries, the relationship between some relatives is allowed, but marriage between them is not accepted, for example. Now we know that inbreeding doesn't necessarily produce murderers, but we know that its rampant practice has brought about major changes in humanity. Many argue that this is what has demonized and made incest taboo in recent times. And that is, beyond our evolution, many times humans opt for the shortest path. And we believe it's better to generate fear than to provide a consistent argument. That concludes today's video. I hope you enjoyed this unique special on endogamous families, a departure from our usual content. People were telling me about different cases, they were asking me, so I thought, what if instead of making different videos, we make just one, condensing all the cases? So I hope you liked it. I thank each and every one of the members of Magnus Mephisto who appear here on the side. Because thanks to them we can make these videos that are often demonetized and hidden in YouTube recommendations. If your name appears or you want to collaborate with the channel and access uncensored videos without ads, let us know. 24 hours before the rest, you just have to click the button that says join here below. Please like, subscribe, and suggest future video ideas. I'm Magnus Mephisto, see you next time. Goodbye.